This is Rudolf Höss, the man who created Auschwitz, orchestrating millions of deaths. But he met a bitterly ironic end. So what transforms an obedient boy into a genocide architect? Was it his upbringing, the war, or ideology that formed this monster? Rudolf Franz Ferdinand Höss was born on November 25, 1901 in Baden-Baden. His father Franz was like a priest and drill sergeant combined. To him, obedience to religion was the only proof of love, so Rudolf became a staunch devotee to please his father. While other young boys played around, Rudolf learned about sin and attended weekly confessions. After all, there was no room for error. Those practices led him to lose tolerance toward others' errors as well, turning him into an emotionless robot at a young age. But that leash of control suddenly vanished. In 1914, his father died, and with him died every sense of accountability. Rudolf never confessed again. It was as if he had been liberated. Around the same years, the Great War erupted, and the boy who had been conditioned to kneel found a new calling: the military. He cleverly lied about his age and joined the cavalry, serving on Turkish fronts. The one thing Rudolf had mastered from his father's strictness was compliance, and it soon made him every war official's preference. By only 16, he had the Iron Cross, his young chest pinned with first and second class medals. He realized that his fulfillment was never in prayers, it was in war. However, by 1918, those medals too lost their meaning. When the war ended, Germany had to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which meant accepting itself as the villain. The once proud German Empire was replaced by the fragile Weimar Republic, forcing the people to lose trust in their soldiers. They labeled them as war criminals and traitors. So, when the only structure Rudolf knew, the military, collapsed, he didn't know how to live anymore. To regain some sense of purpose, he joined the Freikorps, a group of ex-soldiers obsessed with restoring German honor and ending anyone who appeared disloyal. But to just what extent can a self-righteous militant go in the name of duty? One night in May 1923, 22-year-old Rudolf and other members of the Freikorps dragged a school teacher out of his home in the middle of the night. His name was Walter Kadow, and he had previously served next to a German war hero, Albert Leo Schlegeter. That night, they took him to a secluded field and ruthlessly beat him with sticks and rifle butts. Reports have stated that they tortured him slowly until dawn. And by the next morning, Walter was dead. But now, you might wonder, why would they attack one of their own? Well, 3 months ago, Albert was executed by the French for his involvement in acts of sabotage, and the radical nationalists believed Walter was the one who blew the whistle. Although there was no proof, Rudolf and his group never needed any. To them, betrayal was an unforgivable error that needed to be dealt with fiercely. However, before Rudolf could exercise his twisted beliefs more, he got caught. The authorities arrested him for the teacher's murder and put him on trial, and he eventually got sentenced to just 10 years in prison. As one can guess, instead of reflecting, that time in prison further reinforced his conviction that duty surpassed all morals. Rudolf never once regretted killing Walter Kadow. He didn't even complete his sentence and got out in just 5 years. Outside the cell, Germany was undergoing a massive change. The Nazi Party was rising, preaching the ideology of racial hierarchy, anti-Semitism, and the need for violence to maintain control. It was exactly what men like Rudolf wanted to hear. So he immediately joined the party's violent paramilitary wing. Rudolf's ability to enforce allowed him to climb the ranks quickly, and he soon became an indispensable asset to the party. Now, there was an emotion one would never expect from someone like Rudolf. In 1929, Rudolf fell in love and married 21-year-old Hedwig Hensel. It was astonishing to see how different he was at home, an attentive father and husband, when outside he was a ruthless perpetrator with no regard for human life. Over the next year, the Nazis had gained a significant following. However, they were still just a radical movement, but everything changed when their leader, Adolf Hitler, came to power in 1933. From that point on, the Nazis slowly became Germany's sole legal party. The one principle they valued the most was the Führer principle that emphasized absolute loyalty to Hitler. And Rudolf fit that criteria all too well. Given his dedication, he was quickly moved from local enforcement into the concentration camps used for political prisoners. Historical records indicate that camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen taught him administration and logistics, but in reality, they twisted his already disrupted ideas and slowly molded his mind to lose the last bit of humanity. By 1940, Rudolf was appointed Commandant of Auschwitz. Despite being a typical camp for Polish political prisoners, it was somehow exceptionally important to the Nazis. That's because that part of Poland had railway connections and was far away from German cities, meaning the Nazis could do whatever they want and no one would find out. Initially, its prisoners were forced into intensive labor under harsh conditions, but that was only the tip of what they had planned. The Nazis wanted something extreme, something the world hadn't seen before. So Rudolf was handpicked for the job, and the man knew exactly what he was doing. He made Auschwitz the central hub of the Nazis' final solution. It was no longer meant for captivity or labor camps. It had become a site for both concentration and extermination. But why were they taking such extreme measures? The roots of Auschwitz lay in the Nazi ideology that dehumanized Jews and other undesirable groups. So Rudolf began designing a system to kill them efficiently, endlessly, and without conscience. The prison was divided into three parts: Auschwitz I, the original camp; Auschwitz II, Birkenau, the death camp; and Auschwitz III, Monowitz, a labor camp for IG Farben factories. Thousands were herded like livestock into barracks that were built for only hundreds. Food was scarce, water was foul, and disease spread faster than hope. Every breath had to be guarded as soldiers beat prisoners for slowing down, for speaking out, or for nothing at all. The worst of all was that human identity was completely erased, and their names were replaced by numbers tattooed on their arms. When they arrived at Auschwitz, selections were made. The young and healthy were sent to labor, and the elderly or sick were sent directly to the death camp. But that level of cruelty was still not enough. Rudolf wanted to carry out maximum eliminations in the shortest time, so he oversaw the introduction of gas chambers and crematoria. Prisoners were told they were going to showers, only to be locked inside gas chambers. And instead of water, Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, was poured from the openings above. Within minutes, agonizing screams would fill the entire space, followed by a deathly silence. Thousands of bodies lay collapsed, tangled together in impossible shapes. Each batch in the gas chamber meant 2,000 deaths at once. And when the operation was completed, Jewish prisoners, Sonderkommandos, would enter the chambers to drag out the unrecognizable corpses. The disfigured remains were burned in furnaces that roared day and night. Smoke from Auschwitz never stopped. In only 3 years under Rudolf's command, Auschwitz had claimed over 2.5 million lives. But even those gas chambers were just a small contributor to what actually went on in that camp. Inhumane medical experiments, most infamously conducted by Joseph Mengele, who was often dubbed the Angel of Death, were kind of a specialty. Prisoners were treated worse than lab rats. They were subjected to sterilizations, injections, and open surgeries, all without anesthesia, all under the guise of science. And while Josef came up with new ways to torture in the name of experiment, Rudolf made sure they were carried out regularly without disrupting the operation of his camp. The man was committed to killing, and the sheer organization of Auschwitz under him showed a chilling mix of ideology and administration. The industrial mindset of the Nazi was burned into his mind, but more than that, it was his father's teachings of complying with orders without questioning them. After he was done scaling one camp to the heights of cruelty, Rudolf was summoned to Berlin as the chief inspector of all concentration camps and was given a very important task to carry out: make as many Auschwitzes as possible. From his desk in Berlin, he advised on methods of killing, more intensive gas chamber designs, and crematoria output across occupied Europe. But his most brutal chapter was yet to come. In 1944, Rudolf was temporarily sent back to Auschwitz to oversee Operation Höss, the extermination of Hungarian Jews. The campaign was so vast that even the SS called it a logistical nightmare. Within 8 weeks, roughly 430,000 Hungarian Jews were brought to Auschwitz. Most were promised resettlement, but Auschwitz was never the place for table talks. Within hours of arrival, 4 out of 5 prisoners were dead. This was the most intense killing phase in the history of that camp. But as the year changed, so did the fate of the Nazi Party. For Auschwitz, the end was close. In early 1945, the military force of the Soviet Union, called the Red Army, advanced and panic spread through the SS ranks. If they got so much as a hint of what was happening at Auschwitz, the entire system would collapse. So, urgent orders came in: destroy records, dismantle gas chambers, and evacuate the captives. Around 60,000 prisoners were forced to walk through the freezing January snow with no food and no rest. Thousands collapsed, and the moment they hit the ground, they were shot. The guards called it clearing the camp, but history remembers it as the Death March. But before the camp could be entirely cleared, what Nazis feared the most had finally happened. Soviet troops barged in, finding 7,000 survivors who were still trapped inside, and their physical state was enough to tell the story of all the atrocities they had suffered. There were piles of corpses, open pits of ash, and warehouses stuffed with human remains turned into inventory. Inside those storage rooms were hundreds of thousands of children's garments, prosthetic limbs, spectacles, and over 7 tons of women's hair. They were all tagged for shipment to German factories. The disturbing reality of that concentration camp finally surfaced. Rudolf wasn't just killing people, he was commercializing their deaths. By the time all the evidence came to light, Rudolf had already fled westward. He joined other soldiers retreating to Germany after the war and attempted to blend back into civilized life. In fact, he even took on a false identity under the name Franz Lang, pretending to be a gardener in northern Germany. The silence of the corpse-piled Auschwitz was too loud to ignore. Allied intelligence, comprising intelligence units from the Allied powers like the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and other nations fighting against Nazi Germany, along with former Nazi hunters, wanted the name of the man behind all the brutality. So they began hunting high-ranking Nazis one by one, but despite being the top executioner, Rudolf's name wasn't widely known outside intelligence circles. Tracking him down looked almost impossible. But someone like Rudolf couldn't remain hidden for long. When the captured SS soldiers from Auschwitz were interrogated, each one of them had only one name for the ultimate ringleader, Rudolf Höss. The intelligence agency doubled down on its efforts to find the man, but before confronting him, it needed leverage. And it found one: his family. Rudolf's wife Hedwig still lived near St. Michaelsden with their children. For weeks, British officers kept the family under surveillance, and one night they were finally brought in for questioning. But whatever the intelligence asked, the family refused to answer, so they threatened the children, which immediately got Hedwig to talk. She reluctantly gave them his new name and location, and with that information, the British military wasted no time. They barged into his location the same night, catching Rudolf off guard. He tried misleading them by insisting on being Franz Lang, but one detail gave him away: his wedding ring. The inside of the band was engraved with Rudolf and Hedwig. Seeing no way out, Rudolf finally admitted who he was and was immediately taken into custody. In his memoirs, he claimed to have been brutally beaten, drugged with alcohol, deprived of sleep, and whipped with his own riding whip during interrogation. Astonishingly, Rudolf continued to deny the scales of his crimes. However, when bouts of evidence, survivor testimonies, and the statements of other officers were thrown at him, it only took him days to crack. He eventually gave a full written confession describing the horrors he had committed at Auschwitz. This first-hand confirmation of the systemic mass murder became one of the most important pieces of evidence at the Nuremberg trials. In 1947, Rudolf was handed over to Poland since Auschwitz was on Polish soil, and the Polish Supreme National Tribunal conducted the trials. While confined to his cell, he wrote an autobiography expressing deep regret over how things had unfolded, but there was no admission of guilt in it, not even an apology for his offenses. To him, everything was compliance with orders. Finally, the Polish court released its verdict. Rudolf was found guilty of crimes against humanity and genocide, and his sentence was as mocking as it could be: death by hanging at the very place he once held control, Auschwitz itself. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was hanged on a plain wooden gallows built right next to the crematorium where he had sent thousands to death. After the execution, his body was buried close to the gallows, but the gravesite was left unmarked to erase any signs of Rudolf's existence. Decades have passed since Rudolf was executed, but those who suffered, their generations, still raise questions. Was the punishment fair? Why was Rudolf's life ended in seconds when he had made millions suffer until their last breath?